This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. Today we continue our ongoing series, Continuity and Change in the Old Testament, with our second to last one, number 15, believe it or not, on the book of Ruth. Now, last video we explored Ezra, Nehemiah, and in the structure of the return from exile, where when they come back, now not all the people are together, and then there's a whole lot of people living there in the land who are not among their group and who are not going to leave. There had been people living in the land before, but there was always the goal to get them to leave. Now that's not even on the table. And so a new focus of religiosity is structured around us and them. Who are we? Who are they? Are we different? Are we similar? How? That's what Ezra and Nehemiah focused a lot on. And if you recall, it ends with the driving out of these foreign wives. That is, what makes us unique? We can't be going and marrying these other people. That's Ezra and Nehemiah's take. Today, we shift and we look at the book of Ruth. And Ruth has a different focus on that. In that, the story of Ruth, and it's a short story, and I will say set a long time before this, set in the days of the judges. But here, most scholars believe this is when the book of Ruth was either composed, or at least when it really spoke to the community, even if it had been composed earlier. Because it deals with this primary question, not one that was really at question with the book of Judges in that period of time. But Ruth is a Moabite. The story is that there is a person, a couple, in fact, Naomi and Elimelech, who are Israelites who travel to Moab. And they emigrate there. And when their two boys, Kilion and Miklon, marry two foreign wives, two Moabite women, one named Ruth, one named Orpah. Well, there's a lot going on in this story, and we're only going to be able to touch on a few things. But the important point is that Elimelech dies. And so they had these two children, Kilion and Miklon. They both die. And neither of them, implied by the story, neither of them had any children. They were both married, but they had no children. Well, this becomes a problem. So Naomi is alive, Ruth is alive, and Orpah is alive. So we have Naomi and her daughters-in-law who have no blood relationship to her. And this means that if Elimelech has died and his children have died and they have no children, Elimelech is now childless. There is no ancestor left, or there is no descendant for this ancestor, which was a very big deal in the Old Testament. They viewed the way that they live on forever through descendants. There was not yet much of a speculation of life after death. So for Elimelech to no longer have a descendant was then to have this line cut off, and this sense that it's almost like a curse in the Old Testament if that were to happen. And so they had a structure for this. And this isn't unique to them. This was already the case. It's called Levirate law, from the Latin lever, meaning brother. That is, if a person dies without a child who has been married, then the widow of this person is to have a child with the closest relative possible to the person who died. It was called a kinsman redeemer. We don't have a real word for that. It's called a goel in the Old Testament. And that relative and it's usually a brother, by the way, but that relative, when they do have a child with the widow, then it's not the kinsman redeemer's child, it's the original husband's child. And that was Levirate law. This is what was expected. Well, that's what one would have thought was going to happen, but there becomes a practical problem that seems to be the case, that Naomi, having adult children, is probably no longer able to have children. Now, in the Old Testament, that's not necessarily a problem because we have many stories of people no longer able to have children who then do have children, but the book of Ruth goes a different direction. Instead, one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, decides, I'm going to go with my mother-in-law back to her family home in Israel. And that's famously where she said, my people will be your people, my God, your God. Where you go, I will go. It's often said at weddings, but it's actually about a woman and her daughter-in-law. And Ruth goes with Naomi, and I will say very quickly, when she says, my people will be your people, my God will be your God, she seems to be saying, not only will I adopt your people, that is the Israelites, and your God, but I will forswear my old allegiance. I actually see this as a story of conversion. Ruth is transferring her identity, no longer a Moabite, but now an Israelite. And so what ends up happening through a complicated problem, once they do get back into the land, and the figure by the name of Boaz, who is the kinsman redeemer, who then, he accepts this responsibility to be the redeemer, to have the child, so that Elimelech will not go childless, but instead of it, having the child with Naomi, which would have been expected, but maybe practically not possible, he has the child with Ruth. So what has happened? Ruth, a Moabite, is fulfilling the Levirate law for her former father-in-law, for whom she has no blood relationship. Remember, in Ezra and Nehemiah, everything was about genealogy, making sure that you really were in this line. Well, Ruth's not in this line, and yet the book of Ruth says she can fulfill this anyway. And why? Because Ruth is not only a Moabite, she has become an Israelite. And in many ways, in practical terms, she has become fully an Israelite. There's a whole series of things happening in the field. Originally, she's allowed to go glean with the foreigners, and then pretty soon she's allowed to go glean with the people in Israel, seemingly welcomed there, and then eventually she's allowed to be treated as family. Remember, it's a kinsman relationship. All before any of this. And so there's a step forward, more and more accepting. And yet she continues to be called the Moabite woman. So she's both things, Israelite and Moabite. And it leads to this question. Remember, they drove out the foreign wives. Well, is she a foreign wife at that point? Many have seen the book of Ruth as a direct response to Ezra and Nehemiah. Or maybe Ezra and Nehemiah's response to Ruth. I think actually this is the questions it's asking. It's pushing Ezra and Nehemiah. You want to dry out the foreign wives. Well, what makes someone foreign? What makes this question of us and them? Is she one of us? Is she one of them? Is that division so easy? Maybe it's not. Maybe, in fact, the question that this really brings up is, who are we and how do we tell? Maybe it's not so obvious to just be able to pick out us off of the street compared to them. Maybe there is far more movement back and forward, setting up multiplicity of identity. It's possible to become both a Moabite and an Israelite. That would have been revolutionary. This is a fundamentally new idea that has come up. And how do we determine it? Is it a religious thing? Your people is my people. Is it an ethnic thing? Is the fact that it was through marriage important? Probably so. That she didn't just decide to do this, she married into it by marrying Boaz. Or was there something else going on? See, it's asking new questions for a new situation that, frankly, during the period we had before exile, during exile, would have almost been unthinkable. This is just to show how different this theology is from what has come before, and yet seen as in continuity. Because once she joins, what is that religiosity going to look like? How are you going to follow your God? Probably through something like the Sinai covenant. Probably through something like looking toward Jerusalem, whatever that meant at the return of the people in exile once the temple's rebuilt. See, the religiosity might look really similar, but now who's included and how? What is that going to look like? New questions for very old situations. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.